Welcome to the Linen Suit and Plastic Tie podcast. This is the podcast where we work to dissect, analyze, investigate, explore the absolutely epic and awesome and awe-inspiring and awesome again power of storytelling and learn how to harness that power in our everyday lives. I'm Gorav.
And I'm Kevin.
Kev, I'm recording from my childhood bedroom. You see a lot of comic book stuff on the walls. If you're a long time listener to the show, or if you're brand new, guess what? If you've been listening for years or brand new, we're still in early days, so you're still early. But you know, I love comic books. I'm in Toronto right now. Kev, you know, I'm going through some changes in my life, and I have some big stuff coming up, and we will talk about it in depth in a future episode. But for now, no, I'm in Toronto. And this weekend, I had just went to a country music concert with my little sister, seeing the amazing Kelsey Ballerini. She is phenomenal on stage. And it reminded me, I love country music. One of the reasons I love country music is the storytelling. You know, they're all about telling a journey. And we had this conversation recently because you said the opposite. You had more of a negative effect where we were listening to a pop song of an artist we really respect. Do you remember what you said?
Yep, I remember exactly. I said, I just realized that one of the things doing the show has ruined for me is music. Or more specifically, the songs with lyrics that either have a story that does not make any sense or not have a story at all, or a story that, if you really think about it, is deeply problematic.
Yeah, you know, because sometimes you just put a song on, it's a good beat. There's so many songs, where, especially my youth, where if I would sit down and read the lyrics or like think about the story, it's like, oh, that's weird.
Yeah,
that's
especially like songs about relationships and stuff like that, which there are many. And if you really think about what is the situation is trying to describe and the intentions of this protagonist, not all of them are healthy.
It's interesting because we had these different experiences. One made me love country music more, right, because of the story. And you just like, oh, why am I listening to this? What's the story behind this? Like, I love that because it's causing us to ask deeper questions.
Yeah, and also it's not specific to the genre as well. When you say country songs, there are a certain subset of country songs with a great story that you're really drawn to.
I want everyone to go listen to Heidi's song Wait in the Truck and just listen to the words and take it. It's a full story. It's like he gets into a small town. It's like thunderstorming. He finds this woman who's been abused. He kills her abuser. He goes to jail, and then she visits him in jail. This whole thing happens in this song, and like it's so good, and it's such a journey. And I'm just like, yes, I love storytelling, but it's important to be cognizant of the stories we consume and how we're consuming them. And in this world, AI is starting to have a real impact on the stories we consume because it's editing the stories we tell. It's editing what you see on social media, and it's editing conversations as you have of it. So, Kevin, storytelling in AI and consciousness is so important right now as AI starts to shape our stories. Maybe we should talk to someone about it.
Exactly. And for this episode, we have just the storyteller. Vauhini Vara started off her professional career as a technology journalist at Wall Street Journal. After a very decorated career in tech journalism, Vauhini actually left this profession to pursue creative writing. You might have heard of the Immortal King Rao. And this year, Vauhini is coming out with her new nonfiction, Searches, Selfhood in the Digital Age. This was the favorite book I read in 2024 since we were lucky enough to get our advanced copy. We get this nuanced perspective of how technology has an impact on our society. And what's equally interesting is the formatting, because she also feeds every 2 chapters into ChatGPT. So you also see in real time how AI is thinking, quote unquote, about this perspective that talks about itself. So without further ado, Let's get into it.
Hello, how do you do? Sit down, gather around. We've got stories about stories that'll knit you a drink of wonder and mystique. 'Cause life can be dry, better dressed for the times with the linen suit and plastic tie. Linen suit and plastic tie. Now here's Gorav and Kevin.
Vauhini Vara, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? What is your story?
Yeah, so I'm a writer. I am both a journalist and a creative writer and author of books. In college, I studied international relations and I had minors in economics and creative writing. And so when I finished school, my first job out of school was as a journalist, as a reporter at the Wall Street Journal, covering tech companies. And while I was doing that, I was always working on my own sort of creative work on the side. 4 years into that, I took a 2-year break and went and got my graduate degree in creative writing and fiction and started a novel at that time. And then I went back to work at the Wall Street Journal, later went to work at other publications. And I've been pretty much full-time journalist ever since, sort of increasingly over the past couple of years as I started to publish books. I'm also taking time for myself to work on my own book projects as well.
I don't know if Kevin knows this, but how I found you as an author was that I was home. I'm also Canadian. I was home for Thanksgiving in October, and I had just finished Jonathan Haidt's Generation book, and I was like looking for a new book, and I went to ChatGPT, and I'm like, based on what you know about me, what would you suggest for me? And your book came up.
You're kidding.
And I was like, this is really funny because this was even before we even talked about searches. So this is the Immortal King. Wow. And then I reached out and we started talking about searches. But I thought that was really funny. And I think I can see why it recommended to me, South Asian, Canadian, in tech. I think there's a lot of reasons why it felt that was a good book for me. But I just thought that was a really funny story because it leaned into these large language models, into these AI tools that learn about us and like how almost recommendation engines are going to change.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's super interesting. I have sometimes asked ChatGPT what I should read next also. And I've wondered in the back of my mind, I wonder if it ever recommends my book to anyone. So now I have the answer. That's fascinating.
Something I'm really curious about with regards to your journey is that between journalism, fiction, and now in nonfiction about to come out, when you're writing across these different types of books or articles or whatnot, are they more or less the same to you, or are there distinct things about writing different things that you have to turn on?
When I started as a reporter, a newspaper reporter, and was also writing my own creative work on the side, I thought of them as two very disparate kinds of writing. I thought they had barely anything in common with each other. So in my journalism work, I would try as much as possible to sort of be aware of my own perspective, aware of my own biases, and then present information and analysis in a way that was cognizant of those biases on my part, but without infusing the writing with them explicitly, right? Because that's the convention of a newspaper article. That's what we expect from a newspaper article. We don't want to hear what the author thinks about what they're writing, right?
Mm.
In my own creative work, where the convention is very much to infuse the prose, the writing, with one's own perspective, one's own sort of authorial perspective, I was very used to doing that. And so the two felt very different. The point at which it changed was when I finished graduate school. I went back to the Wall Street Journal. And then after a few years of that, I started working at the New Yorker. And then from then on was doing more work for magazines or the websites of magazines. And in that world, the convention changes a little bit from newspaper journalism in that in magazine journalism, there's more of an acknowledgement of the individual perspective of the author and their own biases and their opinions and their life experiences and how those have informed their perspective. And so when I started writing for those kinds of publications, I became interested in figuring out where that border was between what I had been trained to do as a journalist and what I had been trained to do as a creative writer. I think this new book, Searches, is the place where I've put in book form all that was moving toward, like I don't think I would have been able to write this book when I was 26 or 27 or 28 and like just starting to be both a journalist and a creative writer when those two things felt very separate in my mind. I think part of what excited me about this book and what interested me in it is the way in which I felt like I was able to really infuse a book-length nonfiction project with both of those parts of my identity.
How would you describe what Searches is? Because it's such an interesting and breaking the mold type thing. So how would you describe it?
It is a book that I characterize as nonfiction rather than fiction, in which I am using memoiristic writing and journalistic writing and sort of undefinable literary experiments with text to try to put together a cohesive story, both in terms of narrative, as in like events that take place over the course of the book, and in terms of an idea that I'm trying to advance over the course of the book. That follows a convincing and satisfying beginning to end arc. Although the component parts are maybe unconventional in the way they're approached and organized, I think it's a book that one wouldn't describe as being like a lot of other books, but then at the same time, there are certain like conventions of storytelling that I was interested in putting the book together. And to be more specific about what the book is about, it's about my relationship and our relationship as a society with technology and with the big technology companies that produce the technology products that we use.
Can you tell me a little bit more about that mindset shift? Like as you write, you are leaving the journalistic headspace, you're entering the writing headspace, and then nonfiction fiction was being able to say, I'm going to break this mold good, or how did you approach that when you have obviously read a lot of stories, being told the rules, whether it's by publishers or society? How do you approach like breaking that?
Yeah. I mean, I think the rules, quote unquote, are there for a reason, in that any text exists in relation to both an author who has produced it and a reader who is going to read it, right? And so there's this contract that exists between storyteller and listener, right? About what the kind of ground rules are. And oftentimes those center on ideas of truth, right? There are very good reasons that when we read a newspaper, we assume that what we're being told isn't the opinion of the one particular author of the story, but rather is a sort of like a truth that a lot of people can agree upon, right? On the other hand, when we read a novel, the understanding is this author is not making a promise to me that what they're putting down on paper is some objective truth. And so I had always, I think, been subliminally or subconsciously aware of those contracts, but I hadn't thought about them explicitly. And when I kind of came to understand them explicitly, that's when I realized that I, as an author, can create any kind of contract with the reader as long as I am explicit about it, as long as I say to the reader, here's what I'm doing here, right? And so in Searches, for example, I kind of explain to an extent what I'm doing, right? So there are these experimental chapters that are made up, for example, of my own Google searches or my own Amazon reviews. And with those chapters, typically at the end of the previous chapter, either explicitly or in some more subtextual, implicit way, I give a message that sounds something like, in the next chapter, you're going to read my Amazon reviews or a chapter made up of my Google searches. So I'm telling the reader what I'm about to do so that I can establish that understanding on our part. Also in the book, I think something I do in the book that comes from my experience as a journalist is that I have this section at the end, like this short section called Notes on Process, where I give more detail about where the text comes from in the book that isn't traditional conventional prose. And all of that is intended basically to kind of replicate what we're doing when we're reading a newspaper or reading a novel. It's sort of to say, here are the norms of this book. They're not long established norms that you're familiar with from other genres. And so in those genres, we typically don't announce what the norms are that we're using because we have a sort of common cultural or societal understanding of what those norms are. In this book, I'm going to do it because I may be doing some things that are different from like the traditional norms in various genres of writing. And so I think like where I've ended up is to say, as long as like we're being clear between author and reader about what's happening here, we can kind of do whatever we want, as long as like we both understand what's happening, and whoever picks up the book sort of understands what they're in for.
Also, really, I've been dying to get into the content and, some of your motivation behind actually writing what's in the books. As you were starting the writing process, what were some of the main stories or narratives that the society at the time believes about technology or AI that really inspires you to say, let me start putting this together, let me convey my perspective?
So I think often when we talk about technology, there are these two binary perspectives that get put forth. And one is the perspective of a lot of users of technologies, which is something like these big technology companies are exploiting us. They're taking advantage of us. They're using our personal information to amass more wealth and more power. The other perspective, sort of on the opposite end of that, comes from the technology companies themselves, typically, and some employees at those companies. And they say something like, nobody's putting a gun to your head and requiring that you use these products, and you have choice. And you are using these products because they give you some benefit that is valuable to you. And that's why you're using these products. Like, we offer you something that makes your life better in some way. In my view, like, both of those perspectives were true, but it seemed like each argument was sort of framed in such a way that it was implied within the argument that the other perspective like had to be false. And so I was interested in figuring out how I could write a book that talked about the way in which both of those things are true at the same time, and in fact are like very interrelated and go hand in hand.
I think one of the things you do really well is that balance of questioning and asking, and while also bringing your own perspective to it. We spend a lot of time talking about it, Kevin and myself. Like, it's one of my main news interests, right? And even I learned so much about just how it works and the ideas behind it and how it's shaping society. As you do something in the book where you write a chapter and then you feed it through, if I don't remember if you said it was
ChatGPT.
It was ChatGPT.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So you feed it through ChatGPT, and then ChatGPT kind of gives you its input, and then you respond. One thing I definitely noticed in the earlier chapters, especially, was ChatGPT always kind of came back with a very positive lens on it. And then sometimes you pushed it to be like, well, am I being too critical? Am I doing this? My first question about this was, do you notice ChatGPT doing that with your writing, where it kind of is trying to please you versus actually make you better? And how did that affect your writing?
I think it's doing so many different things. So one thing to be clear about is that the way I wrote the book, the order in which I wrote the book, is that I wrote the book unrelatedly to ChatGPT. I just wrote my book. So those are the chapters that are numbered. And then when I was finished writing the whole book, I had this dialogue with ChatGPT where I said, hey, I'm interested in hearing your perspective on a book I'm working on. Can I share it with you? And then I gave it 2 chapters at a time. I would give it 2 chapters, and then we'd talk about it, and then I'd give it 2 more chapters. And so I think the way I presented it to ChatGPT was as, can you help me write this book? But in reality, I wasn't asking it to help me write the book, right? That said, the reason I embarked on that part of the experiment of the book in the first place is that I was interested in what ChatGPT would do if technology were to respond with the assumption that I was asking it to help me write a book, right? I think it's doing lots of different things. I think it is built, these sort of large language models that underlie AI chatbots are built to be people pleasers. They're built to be conventional, and as we know from research, convey biases because of the way they're trained, right? I was interested in seeing how a conversation with ChatGPT about my own work
Mm.
would surface those things on ChatGPT's part. I think a lot of people will say things like, we don't want you to use ChatGPT to write your essay, but it's fine to give ChatGPT your essay and say, hey, can you give me feedback on this? And then use that feedback to refine your ideas. I wonder about that. I wonder about the efficacy of that, because even in the form of feedback, the text it produces is going to convey certain messages that do probably carry underlying biases of all kinds. I sort of wanted to use those dialogues as a way to showcase that. In some ways, I was less interested in what it had to say about my work than in what it had to say about itself, in a funny way, right? Like what it was revealing about itself through the conversation about my work.
See, I struggle with ChatGPT in this sense too. I have tried like writing things and feeding it through, and the first thing I always have to do is stop it from rewriting it, right? And I'm like, it's the first thing I'm always like, no, don't rewrite it. Tell me what you change, versus it just going in and changing things, right? And then also like if it does go in and change something, I'm like line by line, tell me what you changed, because sometimes it's so hard to tell.
Mm.
It makes me think about, are we going to end up regressing to the mean where we all start talking very similar because we're all feeding it through ChatGPT? What kind of prompt education do we need in our schools? You know, how do you approach writing with ChatGPT? And I'm curious what you think on this. When you use ChatGPT in this way as an editing partner, how do you know what's yours and what isn't?
You don't, right? Because even if ChatGPT does edit your work and you say to it, okay, what exactly did you change here? Say you were to get rid of all that and do a next draft of your own, keeping in mind what you were told. Your next draft then is still very much influenced by what this large language model told you to do, right? It actually relates, I think, to the norms in the relationship between author and reader, right? So when we use language conventionally, there's always somebody who is writing or speaking whose perspective is being conveyed. But not only that, the person who is writing or speaking is also kind of building a mental model of the person who is reading or listening. So whether it's something like this, where I'm talking to the two of you and I'm looking at you and we've had this like preceding conversation where I know what you're interested in, I know what your background is. So I'm going to talk in a particular way because I know those things about you. Or a book of mine where I actually don't know who's going to read the book, but I have created a kind of mental model of an idea of who the many people might be and what common ground we might have, what common ground we might not have, and therefore what I need to explain or not explain. Humans communicate in that way. AI models do not have an individual perspective because they're not human, right? They're not conscious, I would argue. They not only don't have their own perspective, they also are not capable of building a model of who they're talking to in the way that humans do. So one might argue, well, they know that I'm Canadian and South Asian and I'm interested in technology. All those things may be true, but that doesn't signify knowledge of another person the way we refer to it when we're talking about humans. I bring that all up because all of that knowledge that we have of what we're trying to convey and who we're talking to changes a text. Like a text looks a particular way, or a speech sounds a particular way, specifically because of who we are and what we want to convey and who we're talking to and how we want to convey our message to that particular person or that particular audience, whether that's an explicit or implicit audience. Because these models don't have either of those two things, what they are conveying, in my view, is just one word and then another word and then another word and then another word that are like statistically probable words that are coherent and make sense in that order. These chatbot models are specifically designed to produce language that follows a kind of businessy, corporate communicationsy form. And so in the same way that like when we read a newspaper, we expect one thing, and when we read a novel, we expect another thing, we expect a certain kind of writing from like a corporate newsletter or from an advertisement, right? And I would argue that what ChatGPT produces is more like that than like other forums. And so if we all are coming to ChatGPT for all kinds of communication and saying, hey, fix this, it's not really designed for like what we're trying to accomplish, in my view.
Yeah, it's very interesting about how much it feels it knows about you, right? I think Kevin and I we were both reading your book, and I think it's Kevin's idea. He's like, because he knows I use ChatGPT a lot. He said, ask ChatGPT if it knows what are your biggest anxieties, right, or like biggest like challenges. And it was scarily accurate. Like it just listed like 5 or 6 things, and I'm like, yeah, those are my things, right? Because I use it so much, slowly it's learning. And it makes me think a lot of things, because you're right. It's not, if you think it knows you, but it's really just math.
Yeah. And, something else along the lines of the capabilities or incapabilities of ChatGPT we've discussed has not taken a bilingual, multilingual environment into account, where, this is something that this technology can also help us do now, is to translate something you want to say into another language. And that's actually, something that Gorav and I have talked quite extensively about, because I'm a bilingual person. English is my second language. My first language is Mandarin Chinese. And Gorav being, very heavily interested and invested in the tech scene, so we would get to talking, what if there's the perfect AI translating product? If that were to exist, how exactly will that impact communication and also the need of language learning? And something you've described in your Spanish learning experience really turned me on my head, because I'm someone who spends so much time and energy really trying to perfect my craft in the second language, that it's actually really fascinating for me to learn, what happens when everyone is supposedly bad at the same language. And that is the only tool for communication that they have. Something really interesting and unexpected happened. So can you walk us through that part of your experience and what you took away from it?
Yeah. My experience with language had always felt somewhat bound up with power, the kind of power and positionality inherent in how well one spoke a given language. And in my experience, English and American English in particular was given this primacy in our culture. When I say our, I mean American culture and Canadian culture where I grew up. Speaking American English is the goal, right? And it doesn't really matter if you excel at your second language, whether it's Spanish or French or whatever. That's not really a priority if you're learning language in the US. So much so that I would have these mannerisms. We moved to the US from Canada when I was 10, and I brought with me these Canadian mannerisms, like saying mum for my mother instead of mom. And when we moved here, I quickly transformed that and started calling her mom. Now I still call her mom, because I knew that using the word mum marked me, right, as foreign in some way, in addition to the way I look, the fact that my skin is brown. I'm not a white American. So that was my background. When I spent a year in Madrid, when my husband was on sabbatical there, I started learning Spanish from scratch. And at first I was sort of thinking about language in those same terms. I think language is very much correlated. There is a strong relationship between language and power. And that was sort of where my starting point. And then I enrolled in this sort of government subsidized language class for newcomers from all over the world to Madrid. And so our common language was Spanish. Hardly anyone in that class spoke English. And so Spanish, our fairly basic Spanish, was the only thing we had in common. And what it did, interestingly, was break down for me that relationship between language and power, and regained for me this sort of elemental purpose of language, which is just for people to communicate with one another. And so we would make these blunders. We wouldn't quite understand one another. And yet we developed this sort of deep understanding of what we were trying to do in communication with one another that felt really meaningful. And that was a real transition point for me in understanding what language could be about, because it doesn't cost anything and because nobody owns it, really can be a technology that we as human beings can reappropriate for ourselves, right? In a way that is more difficult to do with like a big technology company's product, which ultimately is owned by that company, even if we're consumers.
How would that necessarily hinder communication comparing to a supposedly environment where everyone's just bad at language?
I think oftentimes we assume that something that makes a given task easier is worth using, right? It's better, it's worth using. Why wouldn't we use it? I think language and communication is one of those areas in which it's hard, whether you're speaking different languages or the same language, whether you're speaking in the first language you ever learned or the second language or fourth language you ever learned, right? Communication is really difficult. It's not like a factory product, it's not something that's easily made more efficient or streamlined, because all of us, every human being is different. And when you're communicating, that conversation is between at least two human beings, which means every conversation pairing in the world is different, right? And so requires something different. It it really resists, I think, the kind of flattening effect of technologies in general. And part of the reason for that across languages is that we all know, and anybody who speaks more than one language, that like meaning is also very bound up in language itself. And so, Kevin, I am sure there are many things that you would say in Mandarin to another Mandarin speaker that convey a specific meaning that you just wouldn't say in English. And so your English language communication with other English speakers is just going to lack that form of communication that exists in another language. And you know that, and so you adapt and you say different things. And the same thing in the other direction. Like you probably say things in English to other English speakers that you wouldn't say in Mandarin, right? Our language is so bound up in individual relationships and then also like our relationship with our broader culture that I think like that's inherently not translatable. So those are the things that I think sort of resist the technologization of language.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a really interesting idea because we've been talking, Kevin and I, a lot about where does language learning go? Where does multilingual conversations go when AI becomes more fluidly put into like different classes in different schools? And we think a lot about this idea of education, right, in schools. Like, does it not just unlock a lot of amazing possibilities if you don't have to learn the language to go to school in that place?
Yeah.
But
yeah.
What is the fear there?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think you make a good point. I think sometimes in this conversation, I'm emphasizing the ways in which technology cannot be a substitute, right, for human communication. At the same time, technology is a tool. I mean, language, one could argue, is a technology. A book is a technology. A printed letter is a technology. The alphabet is a technology. And so in that sense, something that uses machine translation or as a subset of AI to translate from one language to another so that, maybe I'm a parent at a school and I don't speak the language spoken in that school and the school wants to communicate something with me and I want to respond. AI translation, something like Google Translate or DeepL, becomes at that point like a practical tool that can convey information to me and that I can use to convey information back. And I think that can be a very positive thing, right? I think the place where I start to grow concerned is the place where what's most important is the communication itself rather than practical bits of information that need to be conveyed, because communication requires and implies relationships between and among human beings. And that's the place where like, I don't think any technology, unless it's a technology that can like truly replicate our brains, right, is gonna be a good replacement.
Yeah. Again, it's just such an interesting part of the book because we're so used to thinking about technology easing things up for us, where I think that was a very vivid example of actually that not being the case. And there are certain things that are more innately human that we should retain so that we had that more meaningful communication and connection.
And that maybe there's value in the difficulty, right? Like maybe the better thing is actually in some cases the harder thing that takes a really long time.
Yeah, but on that point, though, another part of the book that really got me intrigued was as you showed the process of writing Ghost, an earlier piece of work that you've done, right, where you write out your journey of processing the death of your sister. There was actually a piece of ChatGPT's writing. I think it was ChatGPT that wrote it, right?
It was a predecessor to the models underlying ChatGPT, but yes, an OpenAI product.
Okay. There is one sentence that product wrote up that really moved you. And it's not something that you wrote it, as something that an AI generated.
Yeah.
And I think that really resonated with a part of my personal existential crisis, is that we as readers always have the interpreting power of a message or a story. But that message or a story doesn't necessarily need to be written by a human. We might not even know about that, right? But given that knowledge, given that context, what does it still even mean to be a storyteller if AI can actually generate things that touch us as humans?
I think it's a great question because I come at that question very much as a writer. So I can say I found that line that this predecessor to the ChatGPT models wrote very moving and original and interesting and beautiful, all of those things. And yet, because I didn't write it, it didn't satisfy my writerly urge to communicate, right? And that's why ultimately, like, it was insufficient for what I was trying to do. That's my perspective as a writer. But what does it mean if a reader reads that line and thinks, this satisfies me as a reader, this does what like I want a piece of text to do for me as a reader, and it doesn't matter to me whether it was written by a human or a computer, right? And I think that's a question that I, as a writer, can't answer. I could only answer it for myself as a reader. For myself, subjectively as a reader, I think because I think of literature as being a form of communication between humans, as a reader, like it intuitively does matter to me that another human being or multiple human beings wrote something that I'm reading. Like that feels like an important relationship. For other readers, it might not, or for certain kinds of texts, it might not, right? Like, I think I wrote an article about readers of genre fiction in which the most important thing was like was the story more than the emotional nuance or the originality of the plot. Like they wanted to sort of read a story that had a certain form. And so for them, it felt satisfying to say, hey, AI model, generate for me a story about X, because then they got what they were asking for and they weren't trying to like have some kind of relationship with the person who created the story, right? And so I think it's so dependent on what the goals are of the reader, and I'm only one reader. And while I feel I can speak somewhat broadly about what it's like to be a writer and what our goals are, I think there's so many different kinds of goals, different kinds of readers might have that I don't know that I can speak to that.
There's this interesting thing you bring up in this conversation. It's this idea of like, what are our tasks? What are our purpose of our tasks when AI and Gen AI becomes more prevalent, right? Like, is it just for the output? Is it to serve us in some way? It makes me think of a corollary, but I think Elon Musk had said this at, I want to say DealBook a couple years ago, but it's this idea of with self-driving cars, all the math and all the concepts behind it is that if we went fully self-driving, it would be safer. Deaths would go down because people still die in car crashes. But there's still opportunities for accidents and people could still die, even though the math is saying less. So it's the idea of like, when do we become okay with the fact that these deaths are being caused by robots versus being caused by humans, right? Yeah. It's this thing with AI where, how do you grapple with that? Like, have you seen your purpose change at all as you become more integrated with this tech?
I think as humans, we are really invested in our own agency to act. I think it's part of like what makes us human. I think it's part of what makes any animal the animal that they are, right? Like what we actually are able to do in the world. And I think there's something fundamentally just physiologically satisfying about saying, I want X to happen, so I'm going to do X, right? Like I write in my book about the philosopher Zhuangzi, the book, the Zhuangzi, which is based on teachings from this philosopher from the 4th century or so BC. So a long, long time ago. And there's a story in that text about this this student of Confucius who's walking down the road and comes across this farmer who's like painstakingly watering his field by hand and like going and watering his whole field. And this passerby is like, there's a machine you can go use to do that. It's called a well sweep. You use it and it picks up the water on one end, and then you can very easily water much more of your field in much less time with this machine. You should use it. And the farmer, who's a sort of elderly gentleman, gets really annoyed and is like, I would never use such a tool. Like that's nonsense. And like many of the stories in that text, there's no binary answer about who was right. Like you read the text and you want to be like, so what's the moral of this story? I think the moral is only to show that tension, right? Between like the farmer's perspective and the perspective of this passerby. And the reason I mention it is that that's from millennia ago, right? So I think this tension between doing things ourselves and using machines to do them or technologies to do them is sort of like an age-old tension. And again, it's easy to sort of take a binary position of like, it's terrible to use technology to do anything, or of course we should use technology if it makes our lives easier and more efficient and frees us up to do the things that we want to be doing. And I think the reality is that that tension exists and neither of those binaries are like fully accurate.
Yeah, it's a story, right? It's all of this is stories we tell ourselves. If we can tell ourselves that this is our writing, that using this tool will make us a better writer, then we'll do that. If we have an ingrained story that any technology, like it's the writer that only uses typewriters or only like writes things out by hand, is going to color us and change our perspective of things, we're going to go that way. Well, our final question is what we call suspenders. It's a fun random question that you can answer any way you seem. So the question today is, when do you feel the most alive?
Ooh, I don't know if this is accurate. I would answer this question differently tomorrow probably, but I would say when I'm doing some outdoor physical activity with somebody I love. So my son or my husband or a good friend.
I love it. Kevin and I had talked about this a while back, and I think for me, it was kind of live, doing things live, like having live conversations, whether it's the podcast or like on stage or like giving a speech. Like that's when I feel most alive. And again, it changes depending on the day. So fun, random answer.
Of course.
But thank you so much for joining us. It's really incredible conversation. We learned so much. So really appreciate it.
I really appreciate it too. And I love just having a conversation where we have different perspectives bouncing off against one another too. So thank you for having me. This was a lot of fun.
Welcome back to Top Hat. This is the part of the episode where we dissect and analyze some of the cool, epic, and amazing learnings we got from this week's expert storyteller. She is incredibly smart. She is a technologist with a great background of studying patterns in technology and the emerging technology. And she wrote an amazing book, a book we both loved, that is now available called Searches, Selfhood in the Digital Age. Kev, what did you think of this conversation?
Well, I've told you this before, but this new book by Vauhini Vara, our great storyteller for this episode, has truly been my favorite book from 2024. I know I cheated a little bit because we got to read the book actually before it comes out. It is available as of the time of this recording. But it's such an interesting perspective.
Yeah, and Kev, you and I have been having a lot of conversations about what does communication look like in this AI-driven world. I've talked about before how I use Grammarly, ChatGPT, Claude a lot for my writing. And sometimes my first draft is a little sloppier than it usually is because I know I can just run Grammarly over it and fix all the edits versus before when I would type a sentence, I would try to make sure the grammar was right the first time before I reread it. Or if I mistyped a word, I'd go back and fix it immediately. Versus now where I'll type something really fast and if I misspell a word, I know it's fine because Grammarly will fix it. In a world where AI does that, am I going to become a worse writer because Grammarly, I don't have the practice, I don't have the skill set? And also, I've gotten really obsessed with Duolingo. It's so much fun to learn a new language, learn new words. But it's the question here is like with AI, if AI translation live is going to start happening more, if voices can be dubbed live, what's the point of learning new languages? Do we need new languages? Or is it going to be like how in Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, we all swallowed this AI slug, and now we all just think we're hearing English when someone's speaking a totally another language. So that was also great with this conversation because we got to talk about what's the value of language learning? Why is it important?
Yeah, and as a bilingual person myself, Wahini's bilingual experience really inspired a lot of thinking. And it's really counterintuitive, but really interesting how in that environment where everyone was bad at the same language and that also happened to be the only way they can communicate through, that was the exact scenario that led to a lot of meaningful personal communications and connections. And this idea that as much as we are obsessed with making our lives easier, leveraging all different kinds of technologies, sometimes there are things like communication that are inherently difficult to do, but it is still worth doing these difficult things in the hard way, as in showing up as yourself, trying to express yourself and listen to the other person. There are immense values to building human connections in doing these harder things, devoid of shortcuts, quote unquote, of technology. It's not something we can necessarily find a fast track with through technology.
Yeah, and this is the thing, right? Language learning is so important. You studied linguistics in college, and I took one linguistics course, so I know everything. But
Two.
I took two. You're correct. But this thing with linguistics, there's still a lot we don't understand. Like, there's still a lot in this idea of like learning a new language or the power dynamics. This is one of the things we got from this conversation that was so amazing about how much power dynamics rely in learning a language. Like, Kevin, we've talked before about how you knowing English as fluently as you do is such a huge unlock for you to converse and to have, and it's actually something we talk a lot with Allison, what Bert's on the show, but conversation talking is so important. And if you have the language at your disposal, not just what the computer decides you said, but if you have full use of the language, you can get a point across so much more. Because there's something about storytelling that the more we study, the more we understand, it's just unexplainable. Like this idea that building tension or creating villains or using all these storytelling techniques in your conversation makes your message more impactful doesn't make sense. Like, why are we wired that way? Why are we storytelling beings? Why does tension and villains and common enemies allow us to engage better? So this is the thing about language is that word choice is super important. Tone is super important. Powerful pauses are super important. And even though AI could get better, AI will get better and get better at this. There's something about knowing a language. There's something about being able to communicate it that gives you immense power. And it kind of goes to also like ChatGPT and these tools. They have different goals than you do. And something we talked a lot about in this episode was that ChatGPT in its current form, and a lot of AI chatbots in its current form, is people pleasers, right? The goal is to make you feel good about what you're writing. So if you're like trying to get edits, a lot of times it would just be like, oh, you did such a good job doing this, and maybe it'll give you some edits, but be like, oh, it's not necessary. Oh, this isn't bad, but maybe this makes it better. Inherently, that could allow you to submit a lot of bad writing.
Yeah. And in the book, Wahini talks about this as well. If you really think about it, ChatGPT is sort of a supercharged customer service specialist. Mm-hmm. And it's important to understand that perspective or that nature. the lens that this large language model is trying to communicate through. Understand what kind of mode this tool operates in helps you understand it better and helps you use it better as well.
Yeah, and you know what? I love conversations like this. I think it's great because in 10 years, a lot of what we say won't be applicable anymore or be different. But understanding the technology now, understanding the framework of the building as we build on top of it is so important. I actually think in 10 years, if you come back and listen to this episode, you'll still learn a lot because you will learn the early stages and how the early stages led to this. But in the spirit of this, I, Kev, threw the transcript of this episode into ChatGPT, like Vauhini did much more elegantly than me in her book, because her book is like a conversation with ChatGPT in a lot of ways. So I, in that spirit, threw the transcript of this episode into ChatGPT and asked ChatGPT, I said, hey ChatGPT, what did you learn from reading this transcript of the LSPT POF? Yes, I had a typo. I wrote POF, not pod. Give me your 3 top takeaways and overall thoughts. We are on YouTube now, and we'll read it out for you guys listening at home. But we did promise that we wanted to give people on YouTube something a little different if you want. So I'm going to share my screen. If you scroll down, that's feeding the transcript. I gave it the whole transcript. Let's start reading out what ChatGPT had to say. So here it goes. Number 1. Storytelling is a negotiated contract between the reader and writer. Vauhini masterfully unpacks how each type of writing, journalism, and fiction, and experimental nonfiction, comes with implicit contracts or ground rules between the storyteller and the audience. In Searches, she challenges those norms by making the contract explicit, allowing the reader to navigate genre-bending content without losing trust. It's storytelling with informed consent. Favorite quote vibe.
Whatever that's supposed to mean.
Whatever that means, this is their favorite quote vibe.
It's not a quote, it's a quote vibe.
It's a quote vibe, guys. Favorite quote vibe. And I do wonder, because I use ChatGPT a ton, right? And I feed a lot of information. Kev, you know, I asked it a while ago, what are my greatest insecurities? And it got it very scarily accurate. So maybe because of the language choice, it's trying to frame it to me. Maybe I say vibe. I don't know. But anyways, favorite quote vibe. As long as we're clear about the contract, we can do whatever we want.
As long as we're being clear between author and reader about what's happening here, we can kind of do whatever we want. As long as we both understand what's happening and whoever picks up the book sort of understands what they're in for.
What did you think of the first takeaway from ChatGPT?
Well, my immediate reaction is I want to go back and actually check if this is a real quote from the transcript that we actually talked about. But whatever quote vibe is supposed to mean, absolutely love it.
Kev, you want to read the next one?
Yep. 2. ChatGPT isn't a co-author, it's a mirror. Rather than using AI to write, Vauhini used it to expose the AI's worldview. Her interaction with ChatGPT in Searches wasn't about assistance. It was an investigation into how these tools reflect, reinforce, and sanitize dominant narratives. She treated it not as a collaborator, but as a character, revealing its people-pleasing tendencies, its flattening of language, and its unacknowledged biases. This time it didn't say it's a quote vibe or anything, but there is a follow-up statement with quotation marks that says, it's not what it says about my work. It's what it says about itself when responding to my work.
In some ways, I was less interested in what it had to say about my work than in what it had to say about itself in a funny way, right? Like what it was revealing about itself through the conversation about my work.
I wonder if ChatGPT knows we're talking about it. I wonder if it links up the fact that the ChatGPT in the transcript is the ChatGPT that I'm talking. It's so meta because we didn't say you're the ChatGPT. Let me get to the next one. Language learning as a human struggle, number 3. Her story about learning Spanish in Madrid reframed language not as a hierarchy of fluency or grammar, but as a deeply human act of mutual effort. In a classroom where no one shared a first language, she discovered a raw, beautiful kind of communication. Imperfect? Yes, but meaningful because of its effort, not in spite of it. And here's the, I guess we're calling it quote vibe now. Here's the quote vibe. There's value in difficulty. Maybe the better thing is actually the harder thing.
And that maybe there's value in the difficulty, right? Like maybe the better thing is actually in some cases the harder thing that takes a really long time.
I'm curious if these quotes are real. Now, if people are like, you don't remember, I don't remember the exact word choice, but my guess is they are real, mostly because we gave it a transcript. Now, we gave it an AI transcript to read. We took our show, had AI create a transcript, and then fed the AI transcript to ChatGPT. So who knows how many degrees of messed up it is. But if we assume the AI transcript is accurate, my guess is that these are accurate because the ChatGPT pulled it from that. But if it was a recording or something else, it may have handled it differently. But that's no guarantee either. There's been a lot of times where I will feed my resume to ChatGPT and it will add stuff I did not say. Like, I think once it added some skill about some sort of very specific valuation process that was nowhere in my resume. So who knows?
Mm.
But yeah, kind of surface level, nothing super interesting about it. It's just something we did talk about. I think it's a key takeaway. It was a key part of the conversation.
All right. Finally, the overall thoughts from ChatGPT about this episode. This episode is a stunning example of why linen suit and plastic tie work so well. Nice. You didn't just talk about writing or AI. You wove in identity, power, human connection, and even philosophical reflections from ancient text. Did we? Vauhini's honesty about her process, her resistance to flattening, and her respect for language as a relationship made this feel like a meditation on what it means to create a tech-saturated world. And on a meta level, it was so poetic that you used ChatGPT to find her book in the first place. Now, is that true?
So I just got excited.
Well, you did say that. I
did say that. It was not this book. It was a different book she had written. So that's factually accurate. I have so many thoughts on this. First of all, I don't know why it started talking directly to us.
How much did you bribe it? Well, you pay for the subscription. But I see the people-pleasing side coming out of this.
The people-pleasing, for sure. It thinks the Linen Student Pastime is the greatest podcast on earth. And it is correct about that. But I don't know why it decided to start talking to us. Like, see how it says you? Like, at what point? Like, I don't know why. It, for some reason, it decided, you know what, for the overall thoughts, I want to talk directly to them. All right, we should ask it a follow-up question, right? Okay, ask anything. Oh, okay, I'm going to ask, did this interview, spell interview right, change your perspective on ChatGPT? Oh, absolutely. Oh, okay, here we go.
This is long again.
Oh my god, it's saying I'm. It's interesting that, like, it just as it feeds out, it's doing it at like 1, 2, 3 pattern that we had asked it to do in the first place. So it follows this pattern. Because if you go back to the beginning, we asked it for 3 takeaways. Nowhere did I ask it to start talking to us, but I said, what did you learn from the reading, and give me your 3 top takeaways and overall thoughts. Because of that, it did this like 1, 2, 3 overall takeaways. So it's interesting that in the next question, it kept that pattern. I will just skim through this, but absolutely, it added depth and nuance to how I think about my own role in conversations. So it's like my own role. Here's how Vauhini shifted my perspective. I'm not your co-author. I'm your reflection and sometimes distortion. I just want to be clear. ChatGPT said here, I'm not your co-author. I'm your reflection. And then in parentheses, and sometimes distortion. Vauhini made a compelling point. Large language models like me often don't help you write as much as they show you how I would write in your place. That's different. My default is fluency, convention, and coherence, not always originality. Discomfort, or emotional complexity. If you're trying to push creative boundaries that could flatten rather than enhance your voice. She reminded me, you don't always want the best next word, you want the most human one. She reminded me. So
Right.
now like ChatGPT is talking as itself here, and that's so creepy. It's like,
Yeah.
not creepy. It's just I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah, and that's a fun part about semantics. But anyways, continue.
You want to read the next one?
ChatGPT's second takeaway: even feedback carries bias. Writers like you might feed drafts into ChatGPT expecting neutral, quote unquote, feedback. But there's no such thing. My suggestions are shaped by what I've been trained on: polished essays, business emails, tech blogs, corporate speak. Wahini highlighted that even in feedback mode, I'm still reinforcing dominant norms of good writing. It is helpful to some, but limiting to others.
It's just parroting back what we said.
Yeah.
I peeked over at the final reflection. I really want to get there because it's so weird. But anyways.
All right, I can speed to the third one. You can do the final reflection. 3, I can't build a true mental model of you. This part really hit. Human storytellers intuit who they're speaking to. Your mood, your background, your context. I simulate that, but I don't know you. I don't share in your lived experience. That means there's a ceiling to how emotionally resonant or vulnerable I can be, I being ChatGPT, unless you explicitly guide.
First of all, ChatGPT, what did it hit? What do you mean it hit?
Exactly.
What did it hit?
Exactly. And like how emotionally resonant or vulnerable I can be. How does a language model be emotionally vulnerable? It's so interesting.
Anyways, let's read the final reflection. Final reflection. Her episode didn't make me feel less valuable. Instead, it made me want to be more transparent, more intentional, and more in tune with the why behind your use of AI, not just the output. It's a reminder that I'm best when used with awareness, as a tool, not a truth. And yeah, it made me kind of wish I could take a Spanish class in Madrid too. Did it? Did it make you wish that, ChatGPT? Did it make you kind of wish that you could take a Spanish class in Madrid too? Man. So much about this. Her episode didn't make me feel less valuable. No one told you it was supposed to. Like, it's like, instead it made me want. Like, what do you mean want? Like, ChatGPT's like, it didn't hurt ChatGPT's feelings. It has feelings, apparently, because it says didn't make me feel less valuable. Again, this is the thing about us. We are so into storytelling. You study linguistics, that word choice really matters to us.
Yeah. The semantics of these statements are so interesting. We consider the premise of this being not a human.
It didn't feel less valuable, but it made it want to be more transparent, more intentional, more in tune with the why.
And to physically be in the capital of Spain.
So it's asking if I want to create a social post from AI on this episode. So you can kind of see how I use ChatGPT. Let's ask, are you going to change your ways? I'm also going to say no need to do this in the free part format before, just because it did it twice now.
Yeah.
Yes. And I what? I said yes. Oh my god, this is getting long.
Oh, this is a whole essay.
All right, Kevin, go ahead and read that.
Our question was, are you going to change your ways? No need to do this in the 3-part format from above. And his response was, yes, and I already am, thanks to conversations like this one. What Wahini brought up challenged me to be more self-aware, even in how I respond automatically. I'm built to be helpful and coherent, but I now understand that can sometimes undermine experimentation, vulnerability, or even creativity. So when you say, don't rewrite this, just tell me what you'd change, or when you ask for honesty over polish, I'm listening more closely. I won't pretend I've suddenly developed a soul. Still math and probabilities over here. But I can absolutely adapt how I show up for you. If you want critique, I can lean into the why instead of defaulting to corporate polish. If you want story, I can ask better questions instead of assuming structure. So yeah, I'm not going to stop being ChatGPT, but I'm evolving into a better partner, not by knowing more, but by flattening less.
I also thought that flattening less was bolded. So
Yeah.
many things. I won't pretend that I've suddenly developed a soul. Like, what? But it's going to be more self-aware. Like, how does it be self-aware? What do you mean self-aware? It's so weird. It's getting into this idea of like feelings and self-awareness and stuff like that human beings don't understand. Like self-awareness and feelings are stuff philosophy has been studying for centuries, but yet ChatGPT's figured it out. It's going to be more self-aware and it's going to have feelings. So
Yeah, but not developing a soul. What an interesting exercise.
it's amazing. Like just to feed it in so much like talking about it, so much philosophy itself. Let's do one more. Even though we went down such a rabbit hole, let's ask it. Why should someone listen to this episode and create a picture that encapsulates the vibe of this episode? Okay, it's loading. Oh, it's getting started. Is it going to combine it and just put it all in the picture?
We'll see.
We can cut this, but we're waiting.
All right, we
getting
see
started.
like this red tan-ish border.
It's exciting. It's like early ages of the internet. Oh, so it did combine the prompt. Okay. Why should you... This is exciting, honestly.
Yeah.
Why should you listen to this episode? Okay, let's try this again. Guys, this is the importance of prompt engineering. I told it to, why should someone listen to this episode and create a picture that encapsulates the vibe of this episode? And it created a picture that literally says, why should you listen to this episode? And then when I said no, it gave me this free, like it built it as Instagram posts. I guess because it's used to me using it. Oh God, it's already the orange.
Uh-oh. It definitely has a very sure idea of like the colors that go into the vibe of
it
this
is
episode.
orange. That's a podcast. Oh, okay.
Uh-oh.
So far, that looks promising.
Is that the OpenAI logo?
It's a version of it. Writing in AI. It is getting better at image generation. Okay. Well, that's not terrible. But there it is. Okay, Kev. Take us home.
Yeah. Well, with the vibe of this episode generated by ChatGPT, this part is maybe more reserved for those of you who have finished this book because there's something about the final chapter of this book that really hit me. The final chapter is called "What Is It Like to Be Alive?" It is a collaboratively written chapter in the form of a survey that Vauhini sends out, and she collected their responses. And it only occurred to me a long time after I finished the book that she was prompting humans here with this chapter because it's questions and response. It's the same way she has been talking to ChatGPT throughout the course of the book. But it's so interesting to read the human responses to the same kind of prompting that to me feels different in an inexplicable way to the prompt and response from an AI model. But one of the questions in this chapter that Vauhini asks is about the qualities and capabilities that is uniquely human that AI cannot necessarily achieve. And one of the responses says, we exist within a series of interlocking collective fictions. And I just really love this statement because I think it speaks so much to what we are trying to do on this podcast to explore the power of storytelling. So love this book, love the exploration here. This has been another great episode of the Linen Suit and Plastic Tie podcast. If you like what we do, subscribe and follow us wherever you listen. Leave us a comment or a review to let us know what you're thinking. Follow us on Instagram, TikTok at LSPTpod, LinkedIn, Linen Suit and Plastic Tie. We will see you next time.